My co-author for this paper is Olga Logunova. Unfortunately, she's not able to join us, but I want to acknowledge her involvement, and she would do a much better job than me because she is actually doing a quantitative part of our project. But I will try my best to answer your questions and explain to you our approach. And I also have to say that I'm very thankful to other of my colleagues, including Daria Khlevnyuk, and an absolutely awesome group of students who work with us on the project. So I'll dive straight into it. And here is the premise of our project. That's the idea that we started with. Basically, we wanted to understand why and how social media users, Russian language social media users, are mentioning those four men in social media, different historical figures, different people that are famous as a part of shared history. We were discussing a lot about which people to focus on, and there were some candidates, very well-known literary authors or other cultural figures, but we settled on political leaders of 20th century, and these four names are actually among those that are mentioned very often in social media in Russia. Joseph Stalin, Vladimir Lenin, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Boris Yeltsin are all or were all political leaders of either USSR, so first three ones, or post-Soviet Russia. At the time of beginning of the project, roughly a year ago, only one of them was still alive. Now Gorbachev is also deceased. Those names were for us a tool to understand how Russians talk about history, about the past in social media, when and in what context they are talking about those particular people, and what other events, time periods, and meanings they evoke when talking about Lenin, Stalin, etc. Initially, we were convinced to make the study cross-platform, and we settled on 6 platforms, which some of them are Russian, some of them are global. So VKontakte is the largest in terms of use social media in Russia. It is basically our version of Facebook with very same features and functionality. And then Facebook itself. Odnoklassniki is another curious one, another Russian one, basically pretty much the same as the first two, with a bit different demographic profile in terms of age and, I would say, regions versus larger cities. Then Instagram is also one of the top most popular social media in Russia. Twitter is not popular at all, but we thought it was very interesting to maybe compare with what we already know about Twitter and history in other regions, parts of the world, and historical topics. And then TikTok, I think from what we discussed yesterday, it's already known that it gets a lot of attention, and it's very fascinating to explore in terms of historical knowledge. And we talked yesterday how there is a possibility of learning to do digital methods ourselves, or have an interdisciplinary team with physics or computer scientists. So we, in our project, basically outsourced data collection, and we worked with a company called Brand Analytics, which is a service for social media monitoring or social media listening, I think it is sometimes called. And we asked them to collect posts from those 6 platforms published in 3 months, from November to end of January this year. And the criterion was last names mentioned in posts, so not only Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin, but also a short version also would do. And we tried to develop a list of stop words. So, for instance, Lenin is a very popular toponym on post-Soviet space. There are lots and lots of Lenin streets, Lenin avenues, and squares, and we tried to omit from the very beginning the posts that were irrelevant but mentioned those names as a part of address, or just mentioned very different people. Gorbachev is pretty widespread name, and so we wanted to only focus on Mikhail on the right, Gorbachev. And then the data was automatically coded with 72 codes developed on the basis of existing literature about collective memory in Russia. And here are some examples. So just to illustrate, if a post mentioned USSR literally, or words like Soviet, so the post was coded with the code USSR, the same, for example, with the rich, which included oligarchs, billionaires, the rich elites, and so on. And then we needed to make our big data smaller in order to work with it. So comparing to other presenters, we actually did some more straightforward and old school quantitative statistical analysis. And initially we had over 1 million posts. We cleaned the data by deleting some whole thematic blocks. So for instance, cars or cosmetology that included lots of spam and ads. We removed posts that were not in Russian, and then we also wanted to set metadata parameters so that we only would focus on posts that got some attention, at least a little bit, which helped us to get rid of some bots or accounts that were not used as public accounts. And that is basically justified by the fact that we want to see how best is publicly presented and collectively and publicly discussed or negotiated. From the that sample, we randomly selected 5%, and our goal was to run cluster analysis and analyze what the result was. And we tried to, we got some nice clusters, so groups of more or less similar posts centered on persons, and there were more than 4. Much more than 4. However, those clusters were not filled thematically, so just clusters centered around persons. And one of the issues we found was that there was still some posts where only the code of a person was a code. So, for instance, just Lenin and no other relevant topic from this list was mentioned. And we left posts that mentioned, for instance, 2 persons, so Stalin and Lenin, or Stalin and World War II. However, I deleted messages that included no other posts than 1 person post. And then we got the final sample for cluster analysis. And we conceptualized that the resulting clusters are memory modes, so modes of mentioning those different people. I am going to show you 2 examples. There are more clusters, but I think this will be sufficient to get the idea of what we have as a part of work in progress. So those 2 clusters, so again, group of similar in terms of codes posts, Those two center or are concerned with the dissolution of the USSR, of course, or events that followed. One of them is more about Gorbachev than Yeltsin, so it actually is about dissolution of the USSR, perestroika, and that whole period. And the other is about Yeltsin, so almost all posts in that cluster include the code Yeltsin. And the second cluster, at the first glance, is just a neutral meaning about Yeltsin as the first Russian president. But then there are additional codes present in, for instance, about 1/5 of posts in a cluster that indicate that there is controversy and dissent on what the solution of USSR and the 90s were, and who is to blame and whether it was good or not. So, for instance, comparing to other clusters, here we see much presence of the code USA. So it seems like there is place for conspiracy-like speculations about the interests of different countries and whether the dissolution of the USSR was a natural process or other forces were involved. We can also see, for instance, in the Gorbachev cluster, the notion of treachery and so basically blaming of Gorbachev on what happened. There are probably some positive evaluations as well, because basically only in those clusters the notion of freedom appears, the code of freedom. However, we know from a more closer analysis that even freedom can be discussed in a negative way as those wild times where, yes, there was freedom, but also lots of uncertainty and even violence. In cluster of Yeltsin, there is also talk about revolution, and in both of those, of course, Putin is also present. But at that stage of analysis, it's unclear whether Putin is he's like those leaders, or he's juxtaposed. So, like, he is a good guy who has to deal with the mess done by Yeltsin and Gorbachev. So it needs really also a mixture of methods. And two other illustrations, very curious examples, I call platform-enabled modes. One is probably not very surprising, but a cluster of what can be called thematically rich texts. They are posted predominantly on Vkontakte, Одноклассники, and Facebook, so textual platforms, despite the fact that there are, of course, stories and reels and pictures and videos. And there are little or no publications in this cluster based on visual social media, so TikTok, Instagram. And a funny thing about that cluster is almost every code is very much present. So present in over 10% of the posts, some even over 50%. So people discuss the war, patriotism, USA, revolution, communism, everything, and there is no particular inclination. Basically, if we look closer again in this cluster, it is like short or even not so short essays about the past and about history. And I think it's a very peculiar mode of discussion and of posting. And the second cluster here is a very strange one. It is literally Lenin and children, where in this cluster Lenin is mentioned in all the posts, and childhood or children in 99% of posts, while other codes are almost non-present. And lots of posts are posted on Instagram and Vkontakte, which makes us think that these are adds, and these are under-cleaned data that still has Lenin as a part of something totally irrelevant. But I think that there are some interesting things stemming from this very peculiar cluster. Childhood was basically our attempt at personalizing nostalgia, which is a very important memory mode. So we hope that people would talk about how they were and how things were when they were children. However, to my mind, this code and this attempt at a personalization failed spectacularly. So there is a need for, at least for quantitative analysis, a need to think about other ways of finding nostalgia. And mentioning Lenin as a Soviet toponym is not just a problem we encounter, but I think it's also a result or a part of research question. So what exactly is this historical figure when it is totally devoid of historical context and historical meaning, and is to many, many Russians just an everyday object that they see on their street as a very, old forgotten monument, or use every day as a part of their home address, etc. So it is both the posts that probably have to be cleaned, but it's also how Lenin is remembered in Russia in a way. I think it's interesting to maybe discuss this, and I think Hanna in her yesterday's presentation also touched upon how some objects that we are interested in can be really used in very different contexts and in very different ways. So current research directions of research in our projects, and I will conclude by this, it really is abundant data, and we struggle with making it more digestible, interpretable, and so on. My colleague carry out topic modeling on posts from textual platforms, and they so far focus on one person and one platform. It can be broadened by, but I think that is what is manageable at this point. We also try to do qualitative or quantitative analysis. We sampled 100 random posts for each person on each platform, so 2,400 posts in total, and we collectively code them in a more robust and more and a closer way, and it actually gave us a lot of insight into what people discuss and how they do it. But also we will get some numbers that we can then analyze. We focus on specific platforms. TikTok, very interesting for us, but also, for instance, Kontakte as the most diverse, I would say, and most popular platform. We focus on specific types of content, so like images, memes, humor, conspiracies. And it may sound crazy, but we are collecting and working with more data because, of course, little did we know, but we stopped collecting data when it actually became interesting and important. So we are collecting data from February and March to see how, for instance, Soviet and post-Soviet history was involved into justification and discussion of Russian invasion into Ukraine. That is it. Thank you for your attention.